Can a community stay exactly the same and still thrive? It's a question that sits underneath almost every debate happening across upstate New York right now. People want vibrant downtowns, they want thriving local businesses, they want coffee shops, restaurants, parks filled with families, and neighborhoods that feel alive. They want their children and grandchildren to have opportunity to stay close to home too. But when the conversation shifts from outcomes to changes required to create them, things get complicated fast. I'm Josh Durso, and this is In Focus, a show about the mechanics of the community around you. Each week, we take a closer look at the policies and systems that shape place across upstate New York and beyond. Today, we have two conversations on tap. First up is Bill Fulton. He's an Auburn native, served as mayor of Ventura, California, and planning director for the city of San Diego. He's also the author of Place and Prosperity, a book that, in my estimation, is must-read material for anyone looking to grow community. Second is Edward Erfurt from Strong Towns. For those who don't know, Strong Towns is an organization that looks to give municipalities the solutions to its biggest problems by doing the research and putting together the proposals that can turn things around. Whether it's zoning, planning, street design, you name it, in some capacity, they have material on it. These conversations are great together because it gets at an absolutely essential point. Bill drives home that defining place in your community is essential to economic success. Meanwhile, Edward grounds us in what communities will have to do to actually grow population and remain financially stable in the years to come.
I told my grandson this morning, he asked me what I was doing today. I showed him my schedule. It was like Zoom after Zoom after Zoom, right? So our whole concept of how we use place and why place is important to us has changed since COVID. My original idea was I wanted to explore that, and we do explore that a lot. I branch out into other topics about cities and urban planning as well, but that's really the connective tissue is how do we think about place and the locations where we are in the real world after COVID, and how and why is that important to us, and how does that shape both our lives and our communities? I would say both our lives, our communities, and the way our communities are governed and run, which of course has been the subject of my life's work.
I'm curious, you mentioned that change, and obviously COVID changed a whole lot. Some communities still planning around that commute-based world that we're all familiar with. Others really leaning into the walkability, the denser sort of build out, even smaller communities. Is it going the right direction? Are more you seeing in your work across the US more and more communities lean into and lean away from that commute-based community building?
Yes and no. A lot of urban planning and particularly transportation planning is based on the assumption of auto-based commuting, right? And most people still drive to work.
Yep.
The number of people, the remote workers, nation. Well, the interesting thing is that since before COVID, the number of people who work at home full time has gone from 5% to 15%. It's tripled. That's still not most people, right? So we still see rush hour, we still see commuting, but increasingly in communities, particularly communities that people are drawn to because of amenities, we find more and more, more and more planning and community planning around those amenities and around life that doesn't revolve around commuting. As we talk, I'm in Bend, Oregon, which is where my daughter and her family live. Bend has a higher percentage of remote workers than any other city in the country. I think they all work for tech companies in the Bay Area, which is my son-in-law does. And the flight from Bend to SFO is full of tech workers all the time. But that really changes the way you think about community. When I was the mayor of Ventura, California, this is 15 years ago now, I always said the most precious thing about it. And also, my recollection growing up in Auburn at that time, the most precious thing about Auburn was most of the people who lived there also worked there. There was very little commuting. This meant people lived their whole lives there. This meant people were invested in their community in many different ways, right? I can remember doing a community plan in Ventura, and we selected a guy to be on our committee, on our citizen committee, because we wanted him to represent the banking community. Well, he wound up the whole time advocating for youth soccer, right? Because he was not only a banker in town, but he was an official in the youth soccer organization. When you have a lot of remote workers, you can get back to that, right? You don't have commuting. You have the ability. My son in law, as I said, works here in this house that I'm in right now for a tech company in the Bay Area. And yet he's able to shuttle his 7-year-old son around and be a soccer coach and things like that. When you commute a lot, that's not possible. The flip side of that is that because in desirable places and job rich places during COVID, housing costs went up so much. We see more remote work. We also see more long distance commuters as people, drive till they qualify and live further away from work in order to afford a house. So it's kind of going in both directions right now.
Yeah. I'm curious I want to do kind of the optimistic look and something that maybe concerns you a little bit. Let's start with the concerning side. When you look at how communities are planning generally, talking big trends, what's something that gives you a little bit of pause or a little bit of concern? And then in a second, we'll flip it and we'll go, what's the sort of optimistic piece that you say?
I still think that the biggest problem in communities planning is that, well, let me back up. I still think the biggest problem is the availability of all kinds of different housing of different types at different prices in desirable locations. I still think that's the biggest problem. I see most communities still doing one of two things. If they are job rich or affluent or in desirable locations, they often try to suppress the amount of additional housing that's built. And then if they are on the outskirts, they sometimes welcome housing, even though from a fiscal point of view for their city or their county, it's often a bad deal. So this mismatch of housing and location remains to me to be the biggest problem that I see. And that's pretty discouraging.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of communities, we see this in upstate New York here, especially outside of the main urban areas. A lot of communities will say they want thriving downtowns, say they want businesses back, say they want large employers back. But then the second housing proposal comes on an agenda or a docket, you know, dozens of people are showing up saying, we want to protect our community character. We don't want to drive down the value of our homes, yada, yada, yada. Why does that disconnect happen in your estimation? Is it a communication problem? Is it a misunderstanding or something in between?
I think it's a couple of different things. First of all, people just don't like change, and their sense of their community manifests itself in a very physical way. When people want to protect their community, they generally tend to try to protect the physical characteristics of their community because that's what they observe and absorb every day. What is often overlooked is that if you don't change the physical character of your community, the demographic character of your community is probably going to change, right? So in a desirable community, if you don't build any more housing, the price is going to go way up. And people like you, if you've lived in the neighborhood in that community for a long time, won't be able to afford to live there anymore. You benefit because your home price goes up. I also think people think that any change will reduce their property values, and that's not true. If more housing is built near your house, and that creates a market for coffee shops and retail and restaurants close to your house that you can walk to, the value of your house is going to go up. So I think sometimes people view property values they use property values as a proxy for things they don't like happening. They assume their property value will go down when that isn't always the case. I've been working recently with a city in Texas that is sort of in this bind. They have a little downtown. They want to improve the downtown. There's a nearby downtown they like. They kind of want their downtown to be like that, but they don't want anything else to change, right? And it's hard to explain to them you don't get one without the other, right? If you want
Mhm.
a market for your downtown, the more people that are in or near the downtown is actually going to help. And that will help you. I think about places like, if you think of, I was just a couple weeks ago in Arlington, Virginia, which is immediately over the river from DC. It was a single family community for generations. The Metro subway came in underground. There's been an enormous amount of apartment and condo development right along the subway line. And if you are living in a single family home 2 blocks away, you're sitting on $2 million. Would not be the case if the subway and that additional housing and all those additional activities that drew would be there. So I think people fear that any change will reduce their property values, and they use their property value as a proxy for their discomfort. When in fact, depending on the change, a lot of change can actually increase your property value.
We're starting to see a real push and rally around the idea of zoning reform here in upstate New
Hmm.
York to
Yes.
unlock more housing
Yes.
opportunity. When you hear those discussions and when you hear whether it's developers, whether it's electeds, and not just everywhere, what goes wrong with how that's pitched to residents to create that conundrum that we're talking about here?
And it's a really interesting time to be, especially in central New York, with
Yeah.
Micron coming in, presumably generating a lot more demand for housing. That's been pretty well documented. And in fact, I'll be in the Syracuse area in a couple months, participating in the local government conference of the Tug Hill Commission, where we're going to talk about all this stuff related to Micron. It's a generational thing. People, older folks who own their houses and oftentimes own their houses outright or with a very low mortgage, have little personal reason to want more housing or to want anything to change. What we see, the big political shift we've seen in the last 10 years has been that in many parts of the country, people age 40 and under are unable to afford it to buy a house. And this is not limited just to California and New York City. This is true in most cities of any size and in many other places. As I say, I'm sitting in the middle of Bend, 100,000 people. It is the most expensive housing in all of the Pacific Northwest. Weirdly enough, more expensive than Seattle, more expensive than Portland. It's a generational shift, and it is always hard to get older folks to buy into what the next generation needs. We've seen this. We've seen that. We often see this in property tax paying for schools. Why should I pay my why should I pay property tax so that somebody else's kids go to school? My kids already went to school. And so I think the marketing pitch is the community you live in and the amenities you benefit from depend on a wide range of people who make vastly different incomes. And if all those people are not able to live in or near your community, your quality of life is going to suffer because these folks are not going to be available. I think that's hard for people to grasp, but I think that's the pitch that's missing.
What is when you think about zoning reform, what do you think the smallest or easiest or most obvious change that needs to happen across the board with zoning?
Well, thinking of upstate New York in particular, I'll tell you something that happened recently in Texas, which is that the state legislature basically, in certain parts of the state, not all of the state, outlawed extremely large lots and said that in many places minimum lot size could not be more than 3,000 square feet. Now, if you go to upstate New York, all over the place, you see 1 acre, 2 acre, 5 acre zoning, right? That is a recipe for sprawl. That's a recipe for traffic. It's fine in a world where there aren't very many people and there's not very much growth, which is what we've
Yeah.
seen for my entire lifetime in upstate New York. But if all of a sudden you're flooded with additional people, additional growth, and additional housing demand, you've got to have development that occurs at higher density than 5 acre, 3 acre, 5 acre lots. So that's the kind of thing that can unlock the market. There will clearly be a market in central New York, especially in the next 10 years for more housing with smaller lots than many rural areas currently allow. So that's just one. I'm not sure if there's a magic bullet,
Yeah.
but that's just one example. And if Texas can do it, my God.
Yeah. So there's one that we hear a lot about now up here that To me, I'm not sure it will have the impact that some folks who argue for it will, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. ADUs, allowing accessory dwelling
Hmm.
units,
Hmm.
it's viewed, especially in a lot of smaller communities, as a silver bullet. But in most counties across upstate New York, we're between 10 and 20 years behind in building. And housing supply is just so far behind. It feels a bit like throwing a penny into the ocean and expecting it to rise, increase water levels. Is ADUs a bit overstated when government folk get together and start talking about the things they can do to unlock housing?
It's tempting to think of ADUs as the magic bullet because it's a relatively, it's not putting apartment buildings next to a bunch of single family homes, right? It's a relatively small increase in density. I think there's a pro and a con to this, and you kind of have to accept the con to get the pro. In California, about 9 years ago, the state changed the law so that ADUs are required everywhere by right. By which I mean to say, you don't go to the planning commission or anything. You just get your building permit and you build it. This has really increased the number of ADUs in the state. The number of ADUs per year in Los Angeles went from hundreds to tens of thousands. The flip side is, are they all really being used as rentals? And nobody knows the answer to that. At UC San Diego, where I'm a professor of practice, we're currently working with Zillow to try to figure that out. A lot of people will build ADUs basically as an office, as an extra bedroom, as a place to park their mother-in-law or their teenage kid that they don't want in the house. That's not a bad thing. That's probably a good thing. I think ADUs are part of the solution. And they're a pretty easy part of the solution to fix. They're not the only thing that will solve the problem.
I'm curious. The last time we talked a lot about Place and Prosperity, your book. You argue in it that place really is what shapes your economic outcomes. What idea from that book do you think holds up strongest today?
Because I wrote that book mostly before and during COVID, and now we're after COVID. I think the thing that holds up strongest is that, well, in the book, I sort of talk about it both ways. Place affects prosperity and prosperity affects place, right? And I use the example of in upstate New York, whenever I saw a factory on the edge of town that was actually open, I saw a healthy downtown in the small town. I got this idea. I can remember once driving up Route 12 from Binghamton to Utica. I would drive through Norwich and places like that, Green, places like that. A bunch of my relatives come from that area. But I think the thing that holds up the most is that there is a market for high amenity communities, and high amenity now means walkability and access to town centers, to coffee shops, to community amenities, not in a car. That doesn't mean that people aren't going to drive most places. That doesn't mean people aren't going to have cars, but it does mean people like to have access to more of a community. There's no question in my mind that there's more demand for that than there is supply. People want it, but we build very little of it. I can tell you a funny example of market response to that. I was moderating a panel of developers in Texas a few years ago. These were master plan community developers. They were used to building golf course communities. They were older guys like me. And they said, well, people used to want to live along a golf course. Now they want to live near a town center. We don't understand why. That makes no sense to us, but they want it, so we'll build it for them. And so I think the most enduring thing from Place and Prosperity is that there is a market for high amenity places in a different way than there used to be. More walkability, more traditional towns, and that intersects with prosperity in a much more powerful way than it did certainly a generation ago.
Communities that are struggling right now or feel like they're struggling right now, whether they're small, medium, large, whatever the size, what would you tell them to focus on first if you were giving them a little piece of advice? Because all of these issues, we're talking about housing, but as soon as you start talking about housing, you're talking about jobs, you're talking about what the community looks like. It can really sort of spider webs out. And all of a sudden, you're trying to solve for 15 problems instead of solving for one. What would be, if there's one thing to focus on first or one place to put your energy first, where would that be?
I would say it's understanding your role in the regional economy, right? Uh, are you, or could you be a job center? Are you simply going to be a residential suburb? Even if you're 200 years old, like some communities in upstate New York are,
Yep.
are you essentially, used to be a little town, are you now a residential suburb? Um, do you have the capability to attract certain kinds of businesses? I would say that's where you start. The encouraging thing is that the economy in upstate New York is more promising than it's been in decades. And remember, 7 million people or something like that live in upstate New York. It's not a little place. That's more people than live in most states, right?
Yeah.
So there's definitely an economy there. But, let's say you are in a rural town outside of Syracuse or Rochester, 20 miles away. Your town was created in the 19th century when you had a little general store and things like that, and you don't anymore. What really is your role? Are you really just a residential suburb? Can you be a retail center or not? And you have to be very realistic about that. You have to be very hard nosed about that. I think that is where, or can you be, if you are a Norwich, right? 10,000 people, do you actually have, what economic assets do you have? Do you actually have a factory that's still operating? If so, how does that drive your local economy and interact with it? I think it starts with an economic understanding of your role in the region and the role that you're going to play, and particularly, take in Central New York, the role you're
Yeah.
going to play as Micron comes in. If the tech hub thing ever happens, which may or may not, given the changing federal priorities, what role are you going to play, and position yourself to play that role instead of just allowing whatever the growth is coming to roll over you, and create, possibly an untenable situation.
Yeah.
That's hard to do. That's hard to do if you're a little village or a little town in upstate New York, which the government entities there don't have a whole lot of capacity, right?
Well, okay, so you bring up a good point. And I'm curious, from what you're seeing and hearing and reading, do you get the impression that communities that will, see benefit down the road from Micron are appropriately preparing for it?
I don't think they can do it on their own. Um, I think that I think, and I think the towns are going to have a much more difficult time than the villages, because the villages are used to being geographically constrained and a little more dense and all that. The towns are accustomed to just, some type of suburbanization. I don't think that though, and this is what's going to be really interesting about my visit to the Tug Hill Commission conference in April, which is at Turning Stone. I don't think most of these communities have the capacity to do this. So they have to rely, for example, the towns and villages around Syracuse have to rely on Onondaga County Planning to help them, even though Onondaga County Planning has no regulatory authority, land zoning authority, it can still help them. They have to rely on Center State CEO, the Regional Chamber of Commerce, the Regional Economic Development Entity, to help them figure out what their, and I know Rob Simpson's been going around to like every little town and village in all of Central New York to figure out, okay, what is our role in this emerging regional economy? And to the extent that you have civic or business leadership in your community, you really have to rely on them, because these village and town governments are set up to do very basic things, and they're not set up to figure out how to handle this kind of growth situation.
Do towns and villages, especially smaller ones, do they need to start working more with each other? Is that a
Oh,
piece? Is
sure.
that
Yeah, I definitely think so. That's hard to do.
yeah?
They tend not to want to do it, but certainly if you think of, I don't know, Western Onondaga County, Eastern Cuyahoga County, just to take an example, those towns are going to play a particular role in the emerging economy. They're not close to Micron, but they would do well to work with the regional economic development leaders to figure out, okay, what role are we going to play? I think that's going to be the topic of the Tug Hill Commission too. What those towns up there north of Micron, what role are they going to play? Right? Are they just going to be residential suburbs, or is there something more? Are you gonna go to Micron and then do all of your shopping at Target and Cicero and then drive back up to Tug Hill, or is there going to be something more to it than that?
Yeah.
And I don't know the
Uh,
answer to that.
It'll be interesting to see how this evolves, especially in the next 5 or so years. Last question for you. I want to get the crystal ball out. If we fast forward 10 years from now, when we look back, what do you think we will, if there's anything that we will have misunderstood about today's housing debate, how it's happening, what might that be?
I think what we've misunderstood, I hate to say this as a land use planner, but I think one of the things we're going to misunderstand is that zoning reform is going to solve everything. Zoning reform unlocks certain opportunities. The market still has to fulfill those opportunities. In some cases, the government has to provide money to fulfill those opportunities. A guy I know just was talking on LinkedIn the other day about a new housing fund for Central New York that has just been created. Uh, One of the things we've learned in California is that zoning reform is a necessary but not sufficient precondition. You have to follow that with lots of other things to make sure that all kinds of different housing actually gets built. And that is not probably just a private sector thing. That's a thing that the private, public, and nonprofit sectors have to work on together.
Bill Fulton, appreciate the time. Thanks so much for taking it today.
Thank you, Josh.
Edward, thanks so much for taking the time. Let's start with this. When someone asks you what is Strong Towns, how do you answer that question?
Yeah, it's a great question. Strong Towns, at the core, we are an advocacy organization working to change our current development patterns. We do that in multiple ways. We are a not for profit. We have a strong member group, and we have donors that help support us in that work.
And how long has Strong Towns been around?
Strong Towns actually began in 2008 during the market crash. This is when our founder, Chuck Marone, started a blog, started sharing ideas about the economy, about our cities, our development patterns. Things weren't adding up. Around 2010, that blog transformed into a 501c, a not for profit, and has kind of taken off and grown every year beyond that.
A lot of people are probably familiar with the book, at least the people who are listening to this. When did that come along in its evolution?
So the Bottom Up Revolution started on the blog. It started mini stories on that. And I've known Strong Town since 2010 when it formed as an organization. And there's actually, it all started with this idea of curbside chats. And so there are some rogue books out there of the early curbside chat stories that then matured into the book. And I think for Chuck and for Strong Towns, writing a book like that, getting that on the shelves is really important. It helps to add to, I get calls all the time as part of my job at Strong Towns from students that are reading this book for the first time, that are realizing that some of the things they're learning in school don't align with the built environment that they see. I get calls from citizens that have found this book in their bookstore or stashed on a library shelf. And they said, wow, this makes sense. I've been trying to figure out how to shift the conversation in my community. I didn't understand why we were doing the things we're doing, and now I have context for that. And I get elected officials, and we've just started a new program of city partnerships. I get elected officials that read the book before they're elected officials. They read it and they all of a sudden make that as a cornerstone of their campaigns, that they want their towns to be fiscally responsible and transparent. They want to have safer streets. They want to address housing. So I get calls from them and they said, okay, I've read the book. I'm living this life. I'm advocating for this. What's next? How do I do all the technical stuff at City Hall to make this happen? So this year we launched our city partnerships program to provide that opportunity to work with cities. And every City Hall I go into, I find the book, I find the quote, I find stickers all over the place. So I just think back to when I was at City Hall in 2010, inviting Chuck to my community to speak. This was all new and foreign. Now we go into communities now in 2026, and the ideas are present, even though they don't know they're from Strong Towns. But that conversation that's happening at that local level has got me really excited on that things are moving forward in a positive direction in our communities.
With that in mind, I'm sort of curious. I want to get your thoughts on some of the things. There's sort of like a where we stand now entering 2026. Obviously, you can't really have a conversation with anyone in the planning space around community planning without talking about the housing shortage, housing crisis, whatever, however you want to frame that. Where does that stand right now? And have we seen any improvement over, say, the last 2 years, or that some of the problems that we've seen historically still pretty prominent to a point where a lot of change needs to occur?
We are in the housing trap, and we have to recognize that the housing trap we're in is a bedrock of our economy. So our economy is based off of this idea of these transactional purchases, ensuring the investment on housing. So that is fundamental on the financial side. And that's not something, when we talk about affordability, when housing is shelter, we can talk about affordability being housing cheaper. When we talk about housing as a financial product, it can't go cheaper. Like, people have made investments and they expect that to see a return on that. What I'm seeing in the market as I'm talking to communities, it is a tough battle. When you think about the addiction we have to all the subsidies, it's really easy to do thousands of acres of suburban housing. The financial systems are there. The planners have identified the systems to go and review those and get those built. The type of housing has been engineered out by all of the builders and construction companies. And then each of those products are then easily sold. You can go get a mortgage for, a couple $100,000 in 28 days. So that's in place. The hope I have, that where I see this is happening, is that we started to work and ask communities and incremental developers, what would it take? What are the things that could occur in your community to help heal that housing crisis at the most local level? And I joke with communities because they try to do a lot of things that are out of their control. And one of the things I try to point out is that if the president of the United States, love him or hate him, if he can't lower the federal interest rate, I don't know how a mayor or city council member can. There's something completely out of our control. But there are many, many things at a local level that communities can do. And we've gone and talked to lots of communities. We have on our website, on the Housing Ready Toolkit site, we have asked communities to look at what we've described as the 6 things that cities could do, basic code reform. What are the most basic things they could do to allow for more abundant housing in their community? We have people have been honest enough to share this. We have over 80 cities across North America that we've posted that up. These are cities that have figured out things they could do at a local level to make housing more abundant, to allow more people to develop it, to allow the next increment of development to come in place. For every one of those that have stood up and raised their hands and said, hey, we've done this work, there are probably 20 or 30 others that just haven't been posted to the map. So that's what I have great hope there. I've also meet with and work with groups like the Incremental Development Alliance and Neighborhood Evolution. These are organizations that are training folks to become incremental developers. These are the folks in our community. Many of your listeners, many people I talk to are developers. They just don't know it. They've converted a bedroom into a rental. They've converted a garage into a basement into a little small apartment. Maybe they've gone and invested in a rental property in a neighborhood. These are incremental developers, people that are investing locally, where the money stays local, and the increment is of character to the block and the neighborhood. Incremental Development Alliance has shared in their 5 years of work, they have trained over 10,000 individuals of how to be incremental developers. 10,000 people have showed up to their workshops and are part of their listservs and have taken their training. That's exciting for me, knowing that cities have the platform in place to allow a variety of housing types, which were not available just a few years ago in many cities based off of zoning codes. And now we have an army of individuals, an entire swarm of people that want to come in and make investments in the community to take advantage of those codes to help heal their housing market locally. And that is taking off. Every time we share one of those stories at Strong Towns, again, we see others that come forward. I've done that too. want to take that advantage. I have cities that say, where are these people? I want them in my town, and working with cities to help them identify where they're at. That has been something really, really exciting for me to see really in the last few months of just that moving forward.
What are some of the most commonly taken or actionable steps that you see communities, the largest swath of those communities, take that just sort of like instantly or pretty quickly unlock things and free things up for that incremental development you're talking about?
Yeah. Um, the things I see are cities recognizing the process and acknowledging the barriers from an administrative or process level in a city. So I would describe this, and I'm somebody, in my experience, I've managed and overseen development departments. So everything from code enforcement up to the economic development, comprehensive planning work. What I see in cities is that you can get a lot of incremental development in with a really bad code, with smart and energized and motivated staff. At a city level, the folks that are in City Hall, if they are move out of gatekeeping to guidance, if they're willing to be responsive in the process, simple things, helping builders understand where is the path of least resistance to approval. That's what I'm seeing. The cities that are actually doing that, whether you want to call it customer service, engagement, there's a lot of different terms cities are doing, but the cities that are being proactive in this process and taking the time to listen to their building community, those are the ones that are advancing. Behind that is code reform. But really, in lots of cities, you're allowed to do quite a bit of stuff, even in the worst Euclidean suburban codes that can help heal the housing market. And we have all of these talented technical people at City Hall and in county government that they just that simple shift of how do we address housing? What's the next smallest step I can do as a technical person, accepting the application, doing the plan review, doing the inspections? Those are the cities that are seeing exponential growth and are stabilization in their housing market.
In December, I'm looking right now at an article you wrote on Strong Towns on the website about what would it take to approve a housing permit in 24 hours. For anybody who's paid attention to municipal government or property development or housing development or community planning, 24 hours doesn't just seem like an incredible outcome. It seems almost impossible, connected to the months and months and months and sometimes years that it takes for developers to get projects just to the moving earth phase. Talk to us a little bit about what you were getting at there.
Yeah, that when I say that and I work with municipal staff, they think that it's like the scene from Spaceballs where I say ludicrous speed and they hit all the gears and move forward. Here's what we're seeing, because there are places that are doing this, and I've managed departments that have achieved this. In South Bend, Indiana, if you talk to Tim Cochran in South Bend, he will tell you in his building department, you can get a pre-approved plan in 23 minutes at the city hall. So how do cities do this? And 24 hours is what we should aspire to because it's possible. But I get all the things. We've got multiple departments. We've got a big stack workload coming in. We've got all of our daily business stuff. What we're really saying here is that in your core downtowns where streets and pipes already exist, what are the things we can do to help align City Hall behind this type of development? I really like pre-approved building plans and that methodology as a starting point, not to approve as a city, not to adopt a dozen house plans to build. But the fundamental idea is that my friend Rebecca Kick in Kalamazoo, Michigan, who has one of these programs, she said they started by picking the cutest homes in the plan sets, right? Like let's pick the puppy dogs and the kittens of housing so that we get over kind of the style piece. Let's pick things that are similar to what is familiar in the neighborhood. And then at City Hall, let's run that through the entire development process from a property owner saying, I'm interested in development on my property, to the building official giving the use and occupancy. When we go through and we look at that process and we outline it out every step, we start to find where we are really inefficient in the process. Those are the things that City Hall can improve. And it's everything. I go to lots of cities and they're like, oh no, we have a building permit process, or we have a permit process to do whatever you want under the sun. here's the 36-page application to fill out. And like when I look at that, it's like, well, do you all have time to read 36 pages of input? Like, how long does it take folks to fill out? The last jurisdiction I was in, our building permit process, the actual application, we asked for the bare minimum information. Where's the property? Who owns the property? Who's doing the work? And what are you doing? That was because of the boxes of addresses folded over to 2 pages, but it was essentially a single page piece. Then when you think about plans and development, what are the things that we need for a successful review? Many, many things when we talk about housing are they're things that are repeated. They're things that are on pre-done forms, energy code forms, HVAC forms, structural package lists. As we work through City Hall, figuring out all of that stuff so we can be very clear to our development community, to our residents, what we need for an application. And we just start streamlining that stuff. I find that for some reason, when the building plan goes from the zoning department to the building department, that's an opportunity for friction where you get different directions. Then all of a sudden you goes to the utility department, and the utility department is requiring changes to building form because of pipe locations. We have all this stuff backwards.
Mhm.
And the one thing I know about government, or somebody working in government is really good at systems and processes. Like process management is just like the thing that bureaucrats love. And it's a matter of, let's look at that and how do we take steps out of it? How do we make it easier to move that stuff through? In some cities, things just like allowing the zoning desk and the building department to review the permit at the same time. Like that's another way you can compress time that, again, is overlooked by cities because they don't understand that love language of the developer, which is their pro forma.
What do you say to the folks who hear that and say, or default to, but the character of my community is X, and these things that you're talking about leaves even if executed perfectly, leaves a lot of room for that character to potentially be changed or to alter the community in such a way that perhaps environmentally or otherwise it brings harm to us long term. How do you approach that conversation?
Well, the first thing is we've got to get all the noise and static out of the review process. When you're spending 3 or 4 weeks on sufficiency to make sure that they have the structural package, to make sure they have the footing detail, the engineering detail, you're using all of your energy to just get the right form submitted, not actually addressing the building form or the things that your community is sensitive to. Environmental issues, height issues, architectural style issues. What I have found is that when I worked with developers and builders, is if the process was very clear and it was definitive how they were going to get to the end, these are the steps that needed to happen, I had much more authority and ability to adjust architectural style, building placement, building typology, the introducing sustainable practices, all of that stuff. I could have that technical conversation with the development team because all those things, in fact, enhance a project. But helping somebody like fill out a 36-page application or wait 2 months to go to a planning commission to get approval for a 6-inch setback, that's the stuff that just burns up all of your credibility in the process. When we go through and we do, I'll give you an example of going through that pre-approved building plan. One of the communities I talked to, they had identified in their community that having a front porch on the front of the house was a traditional pattern that existed. And by default, the front porch got the right building heights and the window placements and all the things like kind of fell into place because people understood the porch. When that pre-approved plan got to the utility department for design review, the utility department said, oh no, you have to remove the porch. You can't have that on the front of the house. And this is like the water and sewer company. And all of a sudden they're like now architects and designers. And normally it would be this battle back and forth. Well, as a pre-approved building plan process, as reviewing that process, the head planner said, I want to know why. Why can't we do that? And the utility company said, look, our standard, it's been so long since anybody's built in our downtown we have all these lots that may get built on, but we don't know where, and we don't know how to be subdivided. So we have just made a determination that we've been running sewer laterals on every project to the middle of every lot. That way we have the best chance of building it once, because we don't know what you're doing in the planning department. And because it's in the middle of the lot, and now you're putting a house with a porch on the front, we can't get the sewer clean out that has to be 18 inches off the front of the house in an area we can access. This is going to be under the porch. Well, a designer would look at that and say, what if we acknowledge that the responsibility of lot placement is going to be the planning department, and on the utility department, your standard should be, because we're going to use the lot sizes that have been in our historic downtown for all the years. You're now utility. What if we move the utility clean out to the platted property lines, the historic plat? That's good, because now we can run like a sewer line or a water line. We can do a Y and get 2 units out of 1. So it's cost effective. And guess what? If it's on the side of the house, the cleanouts on the side of the house, that's a setback that won't have anything over it. It's that type of work that has to happen to move this forward. You could imagine as a builder, if you came in with a front porch, that's a 6-month conversation and requiring all this variances. But as staff moving forward, identifying that as a barrier to abundant housing, we can tackle that.
One of the things that got me really interested in this topic was actually over the last 2 years or so, I've been, or I was on a planning and zoning board. And one of the things that I saw repeated over and over again was just variances doled out left and right, as if the guides that were supposed to exist for a reason were there, but they were just constantly overridden over and over and over again. How much do you see in communities across the board where there's a lot of stuff on the books that just isn't really that frequently used or tapped into or leveraged, and could just be kind of like washed away because modern folks are just approaching these things a little differently?
You could cut a lot out of all of our codes. Now, that doesn't mean, when I say that, people really freak out and they say, oh no, Strong Towns just wants to be like laissez-faire, let all this stuff run. But when you actually, if you've written codes and you administer codes, you start to realize what's happened over time. Somebody in a city decides that they want some new thing, or they've read in the latest planning magazine that we need to address whatever of the moment. And we don't know what that is, but we figured out that there's an award-winning code in another city. So we go to MuniCode, we go to their code, and we adopt that language in our place. Then, so it doesn't really have all of the context of our place, but it was a good code somewhere else by qualified people, and we're going to adopt that. That's why if you look at zoning codes all across the country, they're generally structured the same. It's part of the system. The suburban development pattern allows us to build stuff at scale. It also creates codes that can be spread across the country at scale. So that's kind of the first piece. The other piece is, if you go and you've ever gone through the political and public process of code rights, every time there's an amendment, there's like certain things that you burn up all your political capital for to move forward. And then you realize that somebody built something that isn't right. But you never want to go back to the sign code, because that took 2 years to go through, and we had potential lawsuits and all those pieces, but we don't want a certain type of sign in our community. Yeah. So now we're working on the fencing code, and we say, oh, why don't we slip in that language in there? And we're going to slip in some language so the type of sign, like let's say the pylon sign, we're now going to put something in either the landscape or fencing code that's going to require that to be lower and have landscaping around it. So we've layered in a kind of a gotcha to fix that, but we're not opening the sign code. This is going to sound extreme, and planners push back on us all the time, but I encourage everybody to just read through their codes. The other place that this happens is on definitions. In many zoning codes, your definition includes performance standards. So let's say we talk about that ground-mounted sign. You'll define a ground-mounted sign not to exceed 6 feet in height. So you have a performance standard that's overlapped in a definition. You wouldn't know that when you look at ground-mounted signs. So these things happen. So there are ways that we can streamline our codes to clean them up. I've worked in municipalities where they've got overlays and special districts and optional and required. The thing I always found interesting is across the code of all the disciplines, there are things like just taking all of the definitions and putting them in one pile. That's an easy way to clean stuff up, to build consistency. But I find lots of communities that are out there where the traditional patterns are described as non-conforming permitted, or we have to go in and seek a variance to do something because we've notched down the code so much. In Somerville, Massachusetts, before they updated their code, 99% of the building permits submitted to the city had to go in front of the planning commission for review. These are decks, renovating basement apartments. It was like, so if the standard is everything is a variance, I think something is wrong with that. How do we get it so that a variance asking for permission to do something different is not the standard, it's the one-off? And I think that's the role a lot of planning commissions can sit in and ask, why do we need a variance for this? This looks like everything else on the street. Why are we using our time here to do this work when there are other things that we're more concerned about in our community, whether or not somebody has a basement apartment renovation or a deck addition? We're really more concerned about how do we see that corner redevelop.
I'm curious because one of the things that I found over those 2 years was that as much as folks who had concerns about, and I'm talking specifically about housing developments, as much as those concerns frequently, sort of funneled around, is it a townhouse? Is it a single family house? Is it going to have multiple folks living there? How densely are the units going to be? The thing that seemed to get lost until all the decisions had been made and construction was underway was the street side of design and how these communities were being built out. Is that maybe the one big thing that's being overlooked while everyone is sort of obsessed about the number of new housing units that are being brought in at any given time?
Yeah, we can see the new housing units. We don't understand the street network and the congestion and all those sorts of things, all the underground liabilities with utilities. We don't experience that for years later. So yeah, I mean, when we think about our cities are complex systems. We have just put really orderly procedures on it to make determinations of stuff. The beauty of the suburban development pattern, the thing that it really has figured out, is that the suburban development pattern allows us to yield out thousands of units at scale across every jurisdiction across North America. It is the easiest way to get development. And when I talk to communities, they have very little difference in the development application for an infill 4-unit development in town versus a 400-acre development on the edge of town. A lot of it's the same process. It's the major and it has to get reviews and you have to do all of these additional studies. And what we find with the suburban development pattern is the advantage of scale and mass production has a long-term cost and liability to our cities. As we're finding those things, they're not generating the revenue needed to support the long-term infrastructure liabilities. And it requires all the other pieces. We have to drive more, so it costs us more to be in those places. There's separation to it. Again, if we're thinking at that scale, again, the planners have figured out we need to put buffers and separations that just push things further and further away. That's all by the design. So yeah, when I look at the new subdivisions, there's way more going on there than just what is your density or what are the building typologies that go there. If I'm thinking about that from a business standpoint, as a private developer, or even the city as developer, what are all the other things that are involved in that? How many miles of road are we taking on? How many miles of pipe? How many more pump stations are we taking on? There are cities across North America that are adding that fiscal component. So there is the land use component. Are we allowed to put housing there? There is the performance. Do we have the right street trees and the street widths and all the things that we need? And the third piece, is this going to generate revenue to support itself in the long term? And those are the communities that are beginning to have different conversations on the development that they're reviewing. They're asking tougher questions when you add that fiscal component to it.
My last question for you here is sort of like an all-encompassing one, jumping off of a point you made in the beginning about sort of the existence for the last, say, 60, 70 years of a guaranteed return on a housing investment, sort of a staple of the U.S. economy. Are we reaching a point potentially where, especially folks who have bought houses in the last few years and will be buying houses over the next several years, that if there are not some serious structural changes, that a guaranteed return isn't a thing anymore because of the percentage of the population that's ultimately getting priced out, what that could potentially do to home sales in the future, and just sort of the rising costs of the assets themselves, the build out, and then of course the zoning process and the infrastructure that will ultimately need continued maintenance as long as these homes continue to exist.
Yeah, I mean, we're at a point that our housing, we're hitting a lot of peak of different things. If we look at house prices, we are at our house pricing today is higher than it was when they called the great bubble of the 2004 leading up to the great crash. House prices have gone up quite a bit. We also have to recognize there's only really one type of house product or two types of house products that are being offered in the market because of the financial systems. So those pieces. Yeah, I think it is scary with this from a financial standpoint. If you listen to, in the United States, real estate has always kind of been the bedrock investment. From the beginning, it is always, not only is it federally backed since the 1930s, so guaranteed that if you fail, the federal government will sweep in and protect that. But it's an area that you see lots of folks drop money into because the housing market, even with all of its volatility, is seeing a higher rate of return than if you put on the stock market. So there's those pieces to it. Since 2008, Chuck has been saying there's going to be this great day of reckoning. And for some reason, every year when we think it's going to happen, there's some other weird piece that comes in that seems to backfill it. Housing, I think, will continue to rise. I think we're seeing places in the country where there's a lot of artificial rise that has occurred and they're dropping. If we look at the mindset of home buyers and sellers, if you bought a house and you can sell it for a profit, great. But if we look at what some of the inflated rates have been because of the shortage of housing and location of housing and all those pieces, it may not be what Zillow or Trillia says your house value is. Like you may not see that 50% gain in value. That the reality, it may come down. So there's some of that. But when I look at this stuff right now, we have overbuilt a specific type of house, very large house in areas that are on the edge. What we have not filled in on are smaller homes. We've not focused in on starter homes. We've not provided a variety of home sizes that are affordable by design in our market. Every market study I look at in every community I've worked in, there is at least 30 to 40% of the market that wants the smaller infill housing. We're building less than 1% of that.
Yeah.
So it's an open market. Yeah. Gloom and doom, if we continue on this path, we're gonna have some real problems. The way that's going to stabilize, if we want to see those home values, is I think it's going to require us backfilling a wider variety of house types, infilling in areas where people are being priced out. We can get them priced back in through subdividing lots, going for that next increment of development on housing, taking a large house and subdividing it to a duplex, taking the empty lot where the dirt is really expensive and putting more units on it. All the form in those areas has to be consistent. But what is occurring inside there and how we're building out is where we're lacking in our cities. And that's the work that we're trying to do at Strong Towns, because I think that will stabilize these areas. So the financial product, stabilizing that, but also providing additional shelter in all the communities where we so desperately need it.
Actionable steps can certainly be taken. Edward, appreciate the time today. Thanks so much for taking it.
Great. Thanks, Josh.